So I'm Peter Burrows. It's great to be here. Thanks to George for being here. It's not often that we get to see Goldman bankers out in the wild, especially of George's stature here. So this is a great opportunity.
And by that you mean height, mostly.
Height.
Yeah.
Yes.
Stature.
That's exactly what I meant. So I've been doing this for a long time. Started covering tech around the time you came to the Valley back in the early 90s. So I thought we'd just start talking about a little historical perspective on this whole mobile boom we're in. And give me a compare and contrast to the PC boom, the internet boom, social networking.
Yeah, so it's funny, we were comparing notes in the green room, and both of us came to the Valley around the same time in 1995, which qualifies us as veterans, I think, in the Valley landscape. And the coincident event then was the beginning of the internet boom, and I suppose in general my business career I'm old enough to remember a little bit of the PC landscape shift as well. And I definitely think there are elements of the mobile shift that are at least as profound as those shifts, and possibly even more so. I think one of the things that's really interesting about it is there's a coincident set of platform shifts occurring at the same time, which is mobile, endpoint device change in how we consume compute cycles, at the same time that there's a replatforming of how those cycles get delivered, the cloud. Mm-hmm. And you could argue maybe that's a necessarily coincident platform shift, but they're both really big, happening at the same time, and that makes it, again, potentially even more momentous than some of the other shifts in some ways. Yeah,
it really is true. It's sort of every piece of the industry is going through such transformation.
It's really true. The networking infrastructure with software-defined networking sweeping through that part of the world, and it's really, in some ways, there's more coincident, very fast-paced change going on across technology than any other time in my career.
Yeah, and when you look at the big players, we have Dell supposedly thinking of going private. There, HP, we know the problems there. Lots of the dominant companies of the last couple of generations seem vulnerable at a time when there's all this disruptive technology coming.
Yeah, in some ways that's always the case, right? Which is we live in a world where there are very large, powerful companies in technology that fight amongst themselves, and then there's just the disruptors coming from underneath that are always challenging the supremacy of those big companies. I think one of the things that's interesting, though, when you think about those big company battles, it's been well covered in a lot of the press. The Economist had an interesting piece on it, but among the consumer technology companies, you get this 4 or 5 party battle for supremacy. The Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, they're all shooting at each other. Mm-hmm. You've got a similar dynamic in enterprise with Oracle and HP and Dell and others. And then the same thing going on in the chip hardware landscape with Intel and Qualcomm, which is a really interesting, epic battle. And each of those grand battles is taking place at once, and they're starting to interact with each other a little bit. So consumerization of IT is causing that consumer bundle. Think about Amazon and the impact Amazon's having on the enterprise landscape with AWS. The chip battle is momentous in its own, but also there's questions of verticalization between hardware players and the chip players. Mm-hmm. So that's a fascinating time generally.
Yeah, in scale, it's obviously bigger. We're talking billions of phones, and what Apple said, 40 billion downloads to date through the App Store. But it struck me, we talked a little bit about this, we have seen exactly, I could count 2 IPOs that have come out of this whole mobile boom to date. Now, yes, I know that companies have been, the lifetime to IPO has gone up. It's not what it was in 1995. But explain that. 5 years after these previous booms, we've already had major companies that had figured out a way to monetize.
Yeah, it's true. Look, I think there's always a lag effect where these platform shifts occur, new companies spring up out of them, they ultimately get bought or IPO, and as you say, all the past platform shifts have given rise to a huge amount of capital markets and M&A activity, and I would expect the same to occur here. Your observation's true, which is, at least in the capital market side, there's been relatively little activity, pure play activity thus far. I think that's just a matter of time lag. And while in some ways we've been carrying these devices forever, and so we think geez, this platform shift is profound, but it's been with us for a while. The reality is that's actually, it's more recent in its acceleration. You would think about the arc of sentiment around Facebook and mobile. And so, it's all of this occurring during the IPO and in the wake of the IPO. Is Facebook a beneficiary, a victim, and now maybe a beneficiary again of this? All of that's very, very recent. So I would expect there to be lots of capital markets activity in this space. There's actually been a fair amount of M&A activity. If you think about Google doing Motorola Mobility, you think obviously about Facebook doing Instagram, and they've done a bunch of other smaller acqui-hire things. Microsoft Skype, you could say, has a mobile angle to it. So all the signs are there for the platform shift fueled capital markets activity that we, knock wood and hope for.
Yeah. Well, give us a time frame. I mean, give us what's the IPO pipeline looking like for this year, for example? Do you expect?
Yeah, it's very. I mean, it's so funny. There's a hope springs eternal element of the beginning of any year where we get a lot of inbound activity from people who are interested in talking about IPOs for the coming year. And I would say that pipeline of inquiry is quite robust and interesting. And so, I don't think we're in for a breakout year in terms of the number of venture-backed IPOs, but I would expect it to be at least as good and hopefully better than. Actually, you could make a case it should be meaningfully better than last year. But I think there'll be, I think an increasing proportion of those will be, if not mobile only, they'll be mobile first sort of companies.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask that. I mean, do you expect there to even be such a thing as a mobile only public company? I mean, do you expect to see a lot of companies get to that scale with that?
Yeah. I think ultimately, look, it actually begs a question which you and I have discussed, which is that the right strategy to be mobile only? But will you have companies that style themselves and are de facto, at least in the earlier parts of their life, in mobile only, that'll be successful in capital markets? Yeah, I think so.
Names?
But I probably shouldn't offer any specific names, but you can imagine, this is one that is interesting. Uber is like a mobile only application essentially, right? I suppose you can do it, but it's a mobile only application. That might not necessarily spring to the top of your mind as a mobile IPO,
right.
And not aware of any plans for them to do an IPO, but that would be an interesting one that you could debate. Wow, is that a mobile IPO or is that just an IPO that comes out of the consequence of this big platform shift?
Right. So you were saying how you thought the environment might be a little bit better this year than last. So what's the view macroeconomically? Is it fertile ground out there for?
Yeah, it was funny. I was just, in preparation for this today, I was looking at all of our economists' forecasts last night, and they're extraordinarily sanguine. Actually, I mean, they're not exciting in terms of we're not entering a high growth, super recovery period of time, but there's an element of slow, steady recovery. Our economists say GDP growth in the U.S. is something on the order around 2% this year, 3% next. On a world landscape, it's more like 3% and then 4%. So those are not exciting numbers, but they definitely, one of the things one of our economists said is, while the numbers may not be exciting, the economy will feel better. In other words, there's a lot of elements of things simmering down. There's an increased confidence that the euro crisis will muddle through. There's a housing recovery, knock wood, that makes us all feel better, when we're looking at our bank statements and so forth. It's a persistently low inflation environment. And the big X factor, obviously, is the U.S. government and how we make our way through fiscal cliff dialogue. And our economists have done some very interesting work of what the various impacts are of different scenarios. But I think the betting generally is that we find our way through this crisis. And unfortunately, we're sort of in an environment of that's the new normal a little bit, is managing from mini crisis to mini crisis a little bit.
So I was going to ask whether the political uncertainty, how it affects your business in terms of, is there a direct correlation with?
I definitely, the biggest driver and correlative factor for our business is CEO confidence, and expresses itself in a number of different ways: transactional activity, sense of boldness, willingness to take risk, to make big investments. And that's obviously tied to a sense of, if not certainty, predictability about what's going to go on in the world. And so that was, I'm glad you said that, because when I said initially that there's reason to believe this year could be meaningfully better, I think part of that's because last year was overshadowed by a sense of uncertainty about what was going to happen with the government, and this year we've got some things to get through, but there ought to be slightly more certainty, which would be great.
Yeah. I wanted to come back to one other sort of historical thought about how the wealth is going to be divvied. I'm kind of hung up on this idea that there's been not so few IPOs, and one of the only true app company I could think of that IPO'd was Hippocrates. Tell me if you can think of others, but and they seem to do everything right. They found a good demographic, doctors. They monetized it pretty well, and and yet they just sold the company, and now they're getting sued for having sold it for too little. So I guess I'm just wondering if you think that this whole environment the distribution of wealth will be different. Fewer big winners, maybe more perfectly healthy companies, but not necessarily large public companies.
It's a great question. Obviously remains to be seen. I think one of the dynamics that you'll see is because of those grand battles that we talked about of really big, very powerful, high market cap, cash-rich companies battling for supremacy in enterprise, in consumer, and in the chip landscape, they see and think about this platform shift all day long. And so when you see a really exciting young company emerge and get scale, the idea that they go and buy those guys is obviously quite appealing. And so one of the factors that will dictate the balance between capital markets activity and M&A activity is that willingness of big acquirers to pay big prices for the hottest young companies, for those entrepreneurs to weigh the certainty of that takeout versus the rolling the dice for a long-term play in the capital markets. And so I think that's the really interesting question for what that balance of whether we get a bunch of an ecosystem of young, mid-cap, mobile-first, mobile-only companies versus these things just getting snapped up before they get to the financial scale to be capable of doing IPOs. And the very personal decision entrepreneurs have to face of would I rather be a public company CEO with all the upsides and benefits and risks and downsides commensurate with that, or would I rather be, have this platform to propagate my technology faster, more powerfully, being part of a bigger company? It's a tough decision.
Do you like to see entrepreneurs who come into it with a clear idea about which of those tracks they're going down?
It's interesting. I'm tempted to say yes, because I think that aspiration to be a very large public platform company, have independence, is a symptom of a great entrepreneur. It's not a perfect correlation, but it's a symptom of a great entrepreneur. At the same time, I think part of being a business person entrepreneur is being extremely flexible and thoughtful and analytical and objective about what you do at any given moment. And so I think a lot of the people who actually have ended up selling their businesses have that spirit of the great entrepreneur with a long-term independent vision. They just made very rational decisions to do what they did at any given point in time. But I think that gene of having that aspiration to be huge and have enormous impact is a symptom of great entrepreneurs.
So it's been obviously a bumpy year for Facebook and some of the other IPOs from last year. A lot of talk about is the consumer bubble burst. And yet, last few weeks, we've had those stocks have all come back a little bit. What's your take on sort of the mood of Wall Street about the mobile consumer internet?
Right. Definitely. I mean, I've characterized the last 6 to 9 months in some ways as to be the revenge of the enterprise, which, for a while, being an enterprise-oriented entrepreneur was you were taking a big second seat to the guys who were doing momentous things in the consumer world. And investor appetite shifted pretty profoundly to the idea of just the sense of visibility and normalcy and predictability and the comfort food, if you will, of the enterprise-oriented IPO. I think that's really rebalanced now. I think that was a little bit of a reactive thing, and I think now investors, Wall Street, whatever, just looking for great companies, and there's more of a balanced perspective. So, as we look across our IPO pipeline, it's actually quite balanced across a number of different sectors, including a number of things that might be characterized more as consumerish than enterprise. But if you'd asked me 6 to 9 months ago, we've been like, wow, investors are really focused on a return to the comfort food of the enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, because it has been a very sort of emotional ride investors seem to have been on, particularly with Facebook. How much can you bank on that? Do you try to predict, does this feel like this improving view of the ability to monetize mobile is something that can last?
Absolutely. I mean, we're very focused on this. And part of the reason that I'm here today, which is a question you asked, is just this: the scale of this platform shift, how early it feels to me, and the propensity for that to give rise to lots of activity. We're just very focused on mobile-oriented stuff generally, and yeah, I have enormous confidence. I mean, one of the things that I looked at also this over the weekend in thinking about sitting down with you is how often when you have a big platform shift, the market pundits are wrong, and in what scale they're wrong. And so if you go back to 2007, and I think it's IDC, though it may be someone else, and you say, what were they saying in 2007 about where online advertising would be in 2012 and where mobile advertising would be in, they were off by like a factor of 3, 4, 5, depending on the estimate.
Low.
Low. And so when these shifts happen, they happen fast, and the numbers can get big, and that creates big opportunity.
Mm-hmm. So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the Facebook deal.
I'd be remiss if I didn't say no comment. But the one thing I would say is I think that despite all the sound and fury and the press and otherwise, I think it's a reminder. What's happened to the stuff. This is just a great company that's doing really, really well, and is very focused on executing like anyone else in the landscape. And here we are, however many months later on, and we're just kind of back to this is a great company doing amazing things, innovating, making announcements. And so it's sort of, I think all the sound and fury around the IPO is just, diminished with time, as it should. It's really about the company. It's really about the quality of the company and the opportunity, which is exceptional.
True. Although I wonder if there's lessons to be learned. I mean, for people who are creating mobile companies, questions about valuation. I wonder if a lesson to be learned is just they set pretty high expectations with, I guess, your help, or maybe we can blame J.P. Morgan for that. I don't know.
Back to the remiss by saying no comment.
Okay. Well, let's see. Let's talk a little bit about the mobile space itself. I see you've got a Lumia there.
Yeah, that's my new latest Lumia 920, and so I'm playing around with that. I try to use all the different various kinds of devices. My Android phone is somewhere, hopefully in my car. But so yeah, and by the way, still rocking the BlackBerry. So yeah, I mean it's a multi-device world.
What will you use when you leave here?
Right, that's the real question. Basically, unfortunately, with my job, all three. One's on this ear, the other one's on that ear, the other one's in between my toes or something. Yeah.
But do you think there's room for another platform?
Great question. It feels to me like it would be surprising if this mobile platform shift is as momentous, as wide-ranging, as important as we all kind of think it's going to be. Will it end up being two-platform world to support that? I don't know. I think that would be a surprising outcome to me personally, but I haven't studied it in depth.
Yeah.
And look, Microsoft is clearly going to put a lot of resources behind this, and
yeah,
cool
device.
To
me, it's the Samsung story is something that's remarkable and undercovered by us in the press. I mean, you think of the leverage they have. We all think about it in terms of platforms, but they've become such a huge part of Android, and just the growth. It's almost disruptive in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's amazing. It's an amazing company.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the Jobs Act. A couple of things came to mind. One was there's lots of excitement right now about, or a lot of talk about crowdfunding. It's been mostly project-based stuff. But once some of the final rules are set down on the Jobs Act, it's going to be more of an option for companies to raise money, especially if they don't need a whole lot of money. What do you think? Is that going to have a big impact?
Well, I would also put that in the category of things I haven't studied personally that deeply. I think it's just really early to see. I mean, obviously the Kickstarter thing has brought focus to the idea that you can fund things from non-traditional sources, and that the crowd is an interesting source of capital for ideas. So maybe that theme catches a broader tailwind and starts to impact capital markets. I think it's just way too early to see. I mean, I think it's a really innovative, thoughtful thing to incorporate in the Jobs Act, but I think it's just very early to see. It'd be fascinating. Could be interesting and disruptive.
Do you think there's a lack of capital out there for companies?
No, I don't. I mean, look, the nature of capital is that it's tuned to markets and it's tuned to sentiment. So availability of capital waxes and wanes depending on people's views of what's going on in the world. And there are times when it feels incredibly scarce and times when it feels incredibly abundant. But by and large, over cycles, and certainly for this community of people who are innovating and creating value disruptively in the world, I think there's plenty of capital out there to find.
Okay. And then, the other part of the Jobs Act is the whole confidential filing. It's been, a year now since that's been an option for people. I'm just curious what your take is on that. Is that something a lot of companies are doing? Do you think it's useful?
It is funny. I've always thought I thought that was also a great thing to add because it's a little known fact, but that was an option that was available to foreign companies and not to U.S. companies for a year. So when we did the Baidu IPO in 2005, Baidu filed confidentially as a foreign private issuer and then unveiled the filing right about the time that we went on the road. And it always seemed to me a strange inequity that was available to foreign companies, not to U.S. companies. So I think it's a nice opportunity. Some companies want to avail themselves of it, others don't. It's a very individual choice, but I think I like it. In part because I think it helps this idea of getting more IPOs out there, because one of the issues in the minds, you file and then you still get a long time to go before you're actually on the road doing your IPO, because you're in, getting SEC review and so forth. And so when you unveil your filing, you're telling your customers, your employees, constituents around the company, we're going public. But the market environment could be very different in 2 or 3, 4 months. And so I think it took a little bit, removes a little bit of an inhibition that companies might have had about filing.
And there's sort of no stigma with institutional investors?
No.
Like if you...
No, not that I've detected or heard.
Okay. So I think we've only got a couple of minutes, but I wanted to ask, why are you here? You guys tend to be very much behind the scenes.
Is that a comment on my performance during the interview?
No,
or,
no. Only on
He's
mine.
A tough crowd.
We're trying to set a low bar.
Yeah,
here
right,
for the
exactly,
rest of the
yeah.
show. But honestly, you guys are not very sort of visible and.
It's mostly about improving my clout score. So it's all about actually. No, look. It's interesting that you observe that, and I would say, in some ways, I take that as a compliment. And that my objective as a banker and advisor is to keep a much lower profile than my clients, and that what's important is their success and the amount of attention and success that they get. So that's a lot more important than my clout score or my appearances at conferences. At the same time, it's important for us to get exposure to companies that are changing the world and are around these big platform shifts. And so making sure that I get a chance to appear from time to time at things like this sponsored by fascinating companies that have a bunch of interesting companies in the audience, and get a chance to mingle around and learn what's going on in the world is super valuable for us. And sometimes people think about Goldman Sachs, a big firm, does a bunch of big deals, which is true. At the same time, when we look back at the history of our successes in technology, which are many, the eBay IPO was $72 million IPO. The Microsoft IPO was a similarly sized deal. Yahoo, I think, was a 50 million-ish IPO. So, our business is about finding the most promising, disruptive, exciting young companies, helping them when they're young and growing throughout their life cycle and helping them in a way that can grow with their scale and capabilities as well. So being here is a great pleasure.
All right, well, same here, same for me. I had gotten the sign that we were out of time, so I don't know if we were going to, anybody wanted to ask questions or?
Actually, can I turn one back on you?
Yeah, sure.
So I mean, you have an incredible platform also to look at the world and an incredible network of people to talk about. What do you think about the mobile platform shift, and what are the most interesting thematic things you're seeing as you embark on your new year of writing a bunch of great articles? And
oh boy, I mean, just the scope of it. It's you know, the whole mobile first is happening in the enterprise. It's really remarkable. It makes me wonder about Microsoft. I think that's going to be a really interesting story this year because the momentum is just so powerful. You know, people ask me what I cover, and I cover a lot of things.
Yeah, very broad.
But it ends up, really, it's mobile. So,
is that right?
You know, I mean, that tends to be the thing that you know, most of the stories end up being about it one way or another. So
that in and of itself, that actually says a lot, right? Because your beat generally is technology in the valley, and
right.
The fact that that's turned out to your emphasis probably says as much as anything about what, you know, folks in this audience are.
Yeah, well, it's just amazing to me. I mean, you know, it's bigger than baseball. You know, if you listen to what people are talking about on the train or the boat or whatever, it's their devices, and it's just. I'm also, you know, at some point when the business stories slow down, I just think we're just at the tip of the iceberg and figuring out what it all means for us as humans.
Right.
So.
Very good. All right.
Well, thank you.
Good. Thank you.